Cole's keynote address, The Rise of Religious and Ethnic Mass Politics in Iraq. Professor Cole's lecture and Saturday's symposium on religion and nationalism that will take place at the Center for the Study of World Religions for invited participants brings to a conclusion the Center's year-long series of lectures and panels on the theme Religion and Politics, Complexity and Conflict, a theme that's provoked heated public debate in regard to American domestic politics and foreign policy. As the Center's director, I would like to acknowledge the superb work of the Center's staff, in particular Rebecca Klein, the coordinator of events and programs, and the advice and support of the Center's faculty board, drawn from the Divinity School and the Committee for the Study of Religion at the university. I'm particularly indebted to David Little, the T.J. Dermot Dunphy Professor of the Practice in Religion, Ethnicity, and International Conflict at the Divinity School, who also serves as a faculty associate at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, for his help throughout the year and for his leadership as this conference host. Without his help, without his input, without his leadership and support, the Center's Religion in Politics series and this conference in particular simply would have been impossible. So with special thanks to David, I now turn to him to introduce this afternoon's distinguished speakers. David.
Thanks very much, Don. I appreciate those comments, and it's been my absolute pleasure to participate in this program during the year under Don's very, very able leadership. We're so pleased that this is sort of the culmination of a year-long program in religion and politics, and we're deeply grateful that all of the distinguished visitors have seen fit to participate in this conference and in this session. It's my great pleasure this evening to welcome Professor Juan Cole to the Harvard Divinity School and to introduce him to you. His lecture this evening, entitled The Rise of Religious and Ethnic Mass Politics in Iraq, will accomplish at least two things. First, it stands on its own as the latest reflections of a well-known and very distinguished observer on the situation in Iraq, a subject, of course, of the greatest urgency and interest to everyone in this room. And second, Professor Cole's address this evening constitutes the opening statement for a conference to be held tomorrow at the Center for the Study of World Religions across the street under the title Religion and Nationalism. The conference brings together around 25 leading experts to decide whether the causes of conflict and the arrangements and proposals for peace in Bosnia, Sri Lanka, Sudan are of relevance to the situation in Iraq. The conference will consider the relations among religious, ethnic, and national identity in these four places, and the participants will do that in the context of considering wider religious, economic, political, and geopolitical factors. To our knowledge, no such similar event or comparison has been undertaken, and the organizers, namely Don Swearer and myself, feel that the prospects for lesson learning from this comparative endeavor are certainly worth the attempt. We don't know how it will come out. We don't know whether there are important connections, lessons to be learned, but we do feel it's worth the try. I hope I'm not unjustified in concluding from the remarkable response that we received to the invitations that we sent out that I'm not the only one who approaches tomorrow with a certain air of expectancy. I know some of you here will be disappointed to learn that the conference tomorrow will be a conclave, that is, conclavis, with key in Latin, similar to a recent well-publicized event in another setting. Still, rest assured that we plan to issue very promptly a report on tomorrow's doings, and we will make that as readily available to the public as we can. As an attempt to offset our exclusivism tomorrow, I'm happy to announce that immediately after this lecture there will be a reception across the street open to everyone, and please come to that. Now I turn to the matter of introducing our distinguished speaker. Juan R.I. Cole is Professor of Modern Middle East and South Asian History at the University of Michigan. As many here are aware, Professor Cole has given numerous media and press interviews on the war on terrorism following September 11, 2001, as well as concerning the Iraq War, which, as we all know, commenced on March 2003. Indeed, one reason Professor Cole is here is because many of us have seen his eloquent and illuminating commentary on television. In 1975, Professor Cole received his BA in the History and Literature in Religion and Religions from Northwestern University. 1978, a master's degree in Arabic Studies and History at the American University in Cairo. In 1984, a PhD in Islamic Studies at UCLA. He has lived 6 years in the Arab world and another 2.5 years, as I understand it, in India and Pakistan. His current research interests are focused in two areas of great contemporary significance. One, Shiite Islam in Iraq and Iran. Two, the jihadi or sacred war strain of Muslim radicalism, including Al-Qaeda and Taliban, among other groups. He has written extensively about modern Islamic movements in Egypt, the Persian Gulf, and South Asia. His most recent book is Sacred Space and Holy War, published in 2002. This volume collects some of his work on the history of the Shiite branch of Islam in modern Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf. He also treated Shiism in his co-edited book, Shiism and Social Protest, published in 1986, and in his first monograph called Roots of Northern Indian Shiism in Iran and Iraq, 1989. Professor Cole has written a book on the origins of Baha'i faith in Iran. He has also published on the subject of modern Egypt, including colonialism and revolution in the Middle East and cultural origins of Egypt's Urabi movement in 1993. Professor Cole, we are very, very glad to have you with us, and we are so looking forward to what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction here. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Is everybody able to hear me all right? Good. It's a daunting task to address this subject. We historians mostly would much prefer that our subjects were safely dead and not in a position to object to our going through their old letters and laundry lists. We're trying today here to catch some history on the run. That's usually the province of journalists, and there is an element of journalism in what we're doing. But I would like to try to bring some historical understanding and historical techniques to the understanding of this subject of the rise of ethnic and religious politics in Iraq. And the first thing to say about it is that it is widely denied that there are any such things. That is to say, there is a rhetoric of Iraqi nationalism, which is very widespread and I think perfectly sincere. And if you speak to Iraqis, most Iraqis, with the possible exception of some more nationalistic Kurds, will say that we're all Iraqis together, the Iraqi nation is the main thing, these religious divisions don't matter, and indeed you foreigners are making them up as a way of dividing us, and so forth. I can respect that point of view. However, when I look at the January 30th elections that we just had, virtually every single Iraqi who voted on ethnic grounds. I don't know of any votes for the Kurdistan alliance in Basra, in the Shiite south, And I don't think very many Kurds voted for Muqtada Sadr. And so while that rhetoric of national unity is there, and I think it's quite powerful, and I think Iraqi nationalism is a really existing phenomenon, social and psychological, it is a complicated phenomenon and coexists with what Anthony Smith has called subnationalisms. And this is not an unusual situation in the world. After all, probably most Scots are fairly happy to be in the United Kingdom, but Sean Connery isn't, and there are other Scots who aren't as well. There is a movement for Scottish subnationalism and so forth. So these national identities are very often overlain by regional and religious and ethnic ones. Even France, which one thinks of as kind of the archetypal modern nation state, you have Alsace-Lorraine where people speak German, especially around the French that don't understand German. And you have the Bretons who descended from Gales, and you have people in Provence and the Basque and so forth. So even France is not without its subnationalisms of various sorts. They haven't usually been expressed in a political way in modern France. Where they have been, they've sometimes been repressed. So that's the first thing to say, is that I think despite the widespread denial that my subject exists, I maintain that it does. The second thing to say is that it only recently came to exist. The comic strip Peanuts has a panel in which the rather obstreperous Lucy is explaining the world to Linus and telling him things that are woefully incorrect. And Charlie Brown overhears it and says it will take him another 12 years to unlearn everything that Lucy has told him. And we are all, I think, in this position of having to unlearn what we think we know. We historians are particularly aware of this because when we visit the past in archives and letters, we don't find a familiar world. And the categories whereby we contemporaries organize our world are often insufficient to the past, inaccurate for the past. And so the first thing that I want to impress upon you is that there was no Iraq in the 19th century. There simply wasn't. There was no Iraqi nation. And I can show you books in Arabic that are this thick on the Iraqi nation through history that begin with the Sumerians in the 3000s BC. And I guarantee you that no Sumerians thought they were Iraqis. Very likely they didn't know they were Sumerians either. Nationalism is a modern phenomenon. Iraq is an old word, maybe even pre-Arabic, may have Semitic roots in the region. It has to do with things being green and well-watered. And it probably just means Fertile Crescent, that is to say something like what we mean when we say Fertile Crescent. And after all, if you were an Arab Bedouin and came to Iraq out of Najd, you would be impressed at how green it is. I think the Iraqis must be a little bit bemused by all of our military operations being called desert this and desert that, and sand this and sand that, when Iraq is, where people live, is green, and that's why they live there. In Arabic geography, there was this area, Al-Iraq al-Arabi, which is mentioned by the medieval geographers, and which refers to much of what we now call Iraq. And so the term is not without historical precedence. But mind you, part of Iran was called Iraq. The area around Esfahan was Iraq-e-Ajam. So Iraq was a generic term, meaning, a green place in the midst of this aridity that we have in the Middle East, probably. And in the 19th century, what is now Iraq was a set of 3, sometimes 4, Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. Although Basra was the preeminent of them, and indeed the Ottomans who were in Istanbul tended to depend on the governor in Baghdad to look out over the governors in Basra and Mosul. This map I'm showing you is anachronistic because it imposes those provinces on the map of modern Iraq. And it's the way in which modern nationalism configures the way we see the past is really quite remarkable, because those Ottoman provinces didn't look like that, and indeed Basra extended down the coast into Al-Hassa in what is now Saudi Arabia. So they have just imagined them as modern Iraq is. And indeed, the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, what is now northern Iraq, was often not under Ottoman rule at all. It was often under Iranian rule or under strong Iranian influence. The Baban clan of the Kurds in the 19th century had a strong alliance with the Qajar Iranians. So it just didn't exist. Nations are not natural. There is no national essence that has existed through history and has always caused a people in a reified sense to have a connection with a particular soil. People move all around and genes move all around. Indeed, population geneticists suggest that after 50 generations or so, all human beings become related to one another. This 19th century romantic nationalism, this idea that there are sort of nations which are consisting of bloodlines which are pure. There was a 19th century German theorist and nationalist who wrote that we Germans are a happy nation because our blood is pure. This kind of thinking is a complete fantasy, and nevertheless a very powerful one. Most nations have come into being in the past 2 centuries, most Middle Eastern nations more recently than that, and nations are always constructed by states. The romantic nationalist view is that nations pre-exist states and give rise to them. So we call what happened under Garibaldi in Italy Italian reunification, as though there had been an Italy before the late 19th century that was being reunified. Simply not the case. And what the nation does, what the nation state does in creating a nation, is to standardize the language and to do universal schooling and to write textbooks in which ancient peoples and territories are claimed for the nation. So Iraq gets the Sumerians and Italy gets the Romans and so forth, even though Romans and Sumerians wouldn't have recognized themselves in that way. And then there are museums and maps and a whole range. Benedict Anderson has written about this in an enlightening way, a whole range of ways in which the modern nation is formed. And our subject here is not so much the formation of the modern Iraqi nation, but the formation of subnationalisms, which coincide with nation building. Most nations that are built contain subnations within them, which navigate between a local identity and a national one. And of course, in the worst case scenario, you have what happened in Yugoslavia, where the subnationalisms come to the fore, and the nation is divided up. Political scientist Paul Brass, who works in South Asia, wrote a big book in the early 70s, which is worth revisiting, which looked at subnationalist movements in India, and which ones were successful and which ones weren't. Of course, none were successful in becoming independent of India, with the exception of, you might say, of Pakistan and Bangladesh. But some did succeed in redrawing the provincial boundaries of India. So there was a province that contained the Sikhs of Punjab. Initially, they were lumped in with Hindus of what is now Haryana. And they succeeded through agitation in getting India to create the province of Punjab, in which the Sikhs were the vast majority. On the other hand, there was a group in Bihar called the Maithili who had a distinctive dialect, and they mobilized on linguistic grounds to secede from Bihar, from the province of Bihar. Brass points out that the Maithili failed and the Sikhs succeeded, and he thinks that there's evidence from the Indian case that where you have two markers of identity, distinctive language, as with the Sikhs Punjabi, and distinctive religious identity, as with Sikhism as a religion, that gives a more favorable ground for these subnationalist movements to succeed. By that logic, the Kurds have a shot, the Sunni Arabs probably not. None of the ingredients for a nation were there in the Ottoman period. There was low literacy. I don't know what it was, probably 3%. And only the urban areas had anybody really who was much literate. There was low knowledge of formal Islam. What people did in their everyday lives in 19th century Iraq, when we have travelers' accounts, doesn't look like what we think about Islam. You know, Sufis were known to put needles through their cheeks at fairs. So we would think of this as a kind of carnivalism, but that was Islam. That was part of what Islam was for those Sufis who were performing. In 1850, perhaps 1/3 of the provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul were pastoral nomads. Pastoral nomads are universally illiterate and don't tend to have strong attachment to soil and nation. And you had a substantial population of marsh Arabs, the Ma'dan tribes in the south, who had their own distinctive way of life. Formal language of government was Ottoman Turkish, and I went to Istanbul and looked up documents on Iraq. The Ottoman archives are quite full of them because the Ottomans were running the place. There were many dialects of spoken Arabic. I wouldn't be surprised at all, but that many Arabic speakers in Iraq couldn't mutually comprehend one another very well. Before languages are standardized and you have national schooling and so forth, that's very common. And the Kurdish dialects were also characterized by large divergences, and there were many such dialects. Kurmanji and Surani are the big division between the northern and southern Kurds, but even within those, there are still many dialects, and again, the tendency is in pre-modern times, before languages are standardized, that they're not well understood across villages. When you take a group like the Ma'dan, the marsh Arabs in the south in the 19th and early 20th century, we have many travelers' accounts of these people. They lived in the marshes. They were smugglers. They were fishermen. Some of them did some agriculture. And the Westerners who knew Arabic and who went down there and visited wrote accounts. They don't sound like they were Muslims. I'm not saying they don't sound like they were Orthodox Muslims. I'm saying they may not have been much of a Muslim at all. I mean, they didn't give their kids Muslim names for the most part, and marsh Arab names were quite distinctive. They had their own legends and mythology. In fact, the British, who were very India-centric, even wanted to insist that they were just a misplaced Punjabi tribe. Wandered through Iran, got stuck in the marshes. But this is because they just weren't, the ethnographers, the colonial ethnographers, just found them so distinct from the rest of the Iraqi population. In the course of the 19th and early 20th century, they converted gradually to Shiite Islam. Although, again, probably not to something that most high-powered clerics in Qom, in Iran, would have acknowledged as Shiite Islam. And that's an important thing to say, is that there has been a process of Islamization in Iraq. As people have gone from being more tribal, more rural, to being more urban, more literate, they have been conformed increasingly to the standards of urban literate Islam. But they don't start out that way. And it's a long process, even whereby they adopt an Islamic identity as something very important to them. And the Najaf and Karbala are holy cities, and they are situated in Iraq, south of Baghdad. And from those cities, clerics sent out missionaries in the 19th century to the tribal peoples to try to convert them to Shi'ism. The devotion to the family of the Prophet that is characteristic of Shiite Islam. The mourning of the martyrdom of the Prophet's grandson Hussein, who was martyred at Karbala in 681, and it's famous that the Iraqi popular classes mourned Hussein frequently by flagellation, which the clerics, the sort of formal arbiters of Islam, didn't approve of. But that was again what Islam wasn't necessarily the 5 pillars, the praying 5 times a day and going on pilgrimage to Mecca and those things that we associate with high literate Islam. It was getting up on the 10th day of Ashura and using a whip on your back until you bled. And of course, the clerics often were quite upset with this. So what, if there wasn't Iraq, when does Iraq come to be? Well, it is formed, as with many of the nations in the Middle East, initially as a result of a British colonial incursion. The British conquered what is now Iraq in World War I, and you could turn that around and say that what is now Iraq is what the British managed to conquer in the course of World War I. They sent the British Indian Army up from Basra, 300,000 British Indian troops, and they fought hard campaigns against Ottoman armies, which were generaled actually by Germans, high command, which were detailed to the Ottomans. The first British invasion, in fact, was defeated, and the second one had to be mounted. And not only did the British bring 300,000 British Indian troops, but they brought 300,000 Indian civilian contractors, some of whom were targeted by the Iraqis. There are many resonances from the World War I period and today. The British decided to make Iraq what was then called a mandate by the League of Nations, a kind of colony, but a colony with a term limit. That eventually the mandates were envisaged as becoming independent countries, unlike colonies, which might be kept forever. And there was a kind of paternalistic language about the mandate that the League of Nations would give to Great Britain the duty of preparing the Iraqis to be independent citizens of an independent state. Recently when President Bush said that he hoped eventually the Iraqis would be able to take the training wheels off. This was not a new kind of sentiment that the Iraqis were hearing from Westerners. The same language could be heard from Gertrude Bell in the 1920s. And the Iraqis minded that because Iraqis were characterized by a fairly high degree of urban civilization. Baghdad was a great capital of the Ottoman Empire, a great provincial capital, and so they rebelled when the British announced that they were not going to give them independence, but were rather going to keep them as a mandate in 1920. This rebellion was predominantly a Shiite one, but it was not only a Shiite one. Sunnis joined in as well. And it was in the making of the modern Iraqi nation state, ironically enough, 1920 bulks large as a moment of indigenous Iraqi unity against the British. And there was also a fairly major Kurdish rebellion to being incorporated into British Iraq in the early 1920s as well. Because the British saw the Shiites as seditious, as pro-Iranian, and it's again amazing how these resonances carry through the past century. the fear of the Iraqi Shiites serving the interests of Tehran was there amongst the British officials as well. They then brought into Iraq a client of theirs, Faisal, who had helped to lead the Arab Revolt and who was much more important than Lawrence Arabia in getting up that revolt, despite what Lawrence Arabia says, and who was rewarded by the British with Syria. However, the British had double-booked Syria. They had also given it away to the French on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the British hoped that they'd be able to create facts on the ground and just put Faisal in Syria, but the French, having armies and knowing how to land them, decided to take what had been promised them in 1920, and so they invaded and kicked Faisal out of Damascus, where he had been king for 2 years. So the British had a colony that was without a monarch and which was rebellious, and they had a monarch without a country, so they put them together. This was not easy. At the end of the process, Gertrude Bell wrote in her diary, "I shall never again attempt to create a monarchy." Far too much work. And Faisal was a Sunni Arab from Mecca, having nothing to do with Iraq in particular, and depended on the Sunni Ottoman officer corps that had pre-existed him in Iraq, and the Sunni notables gravitated towards him, the landlord and merchant elite. And so the British basically put the Sunni Arabs in power in Iraq. And the Shiites were relatively marginal. In 1932, the British were so weak in Iraq that they really couldn't control the place very well. The people kept rebelling against them. They demanded that the people in Samawa turn over all their weapons. And Iraqi clansmen in these villages were not men if they didn't have a weapon, and they refused. So then the British bombed them. The British bombed Iraq a lot. In fact, the man who was in charge of the bombing campaigns in Iraq later went on to plan the Dresden firebombing. However, when they bombed Samawa to make the peasants give up their weapons, the peasants still declined to give up their weapons and simply moved away from Samawa. So bombing was a blunt instrument, and the British ultimately had to admit that they just weren't in control of the place, and they gave Iraq quote-unquote independence in 1932, although the British continued to have a hand in Iraqi politics from their embassy. And there was, in this period of the constitutional monarchy, the beginnings of some important state institutions and modern schooling, and Baghdad University gets founded and so forth. But of course it affected a relatively small number of people. Most Iraqis remained relatively rural, and there were low literacy rates and so forth. But as time went on, and especially as you get to the 1950s, you begin to have the rise of mass politics in Iraq. And the first round of the rise of mass politics in Iraq tended to center on parties that promoted universal ideologies. And the petroleum income started to come in. There were modern factory workers and modern workers on the oil rigs, so there's a small proletariat beginning to grow up. The cities expanded. You began to get some of the village kids coming into the cities and getting something of a modern education, becoming more literate. And many of these first-generation young intellectuals were attracted to the Communist Party or to the Ba'ath Party, which was an Arab nationalist party, said that it believed in socialism and equality and that everybody should be all Arabs together as a form of brotherhood. Whereas, of course, the communists were focused on the unity of the working classes. And both of these parties had an emphasis on social equity and on the irrelevance of ethnic identity. So if you were Jewish and communist, then the Muslims who were communists really wouldn't hold that against you. You'd all be communists together. Likewise, if you were Ba'athist, and the Ba'ath got going at a time in a big way in the 1950s after the most Iraqi Jews had already left for Israel, but Shiites joined the Ba'ath as well as some Chaldean Christians. Again, once you were in that party, your ethnic background becomes much less important, and there's a kind of universalist identity to which was being appealed. And this emphasis on social equality was appealing to these young Iraqis, first-generation intellectuals, in part because Iraq under the monarchy had become extremely stratified. There were a few thousand families that owned much of the best land of Iraq. There were these enormous haciendas for landless peasants toiled. I have said that. And the Ba'ath was the one that ultimately comes to power. In 1963 makes a failed coup that only lasts for 8 months, during which it helps to destroy the Communist Party. That coup was made by the military wing of the Ba'ath, which had a very substantial Shiite component. However, it was overthrown by the officers that had been there before, who had in turn overthrown the monarchy in 1958. So the Shiite officers who were Ba'athists were hunted down and killed, or marginalized. And what was left of the Ba'ath Party tended to be the civilian wing, which in turn had tended to be dominated by Sunni Arabs, especially from the region of Tikrit. And it is the civilian, Sunni-dominated wing of the Ba'ath that comes to power in 1968. Now, it doesn't identify itself as Sunni. The rhetoric of the Ba'ath is Arab nationalism. So Sunni, Shiite, it doesn't matter. In fact, ideally, Iraqi, Syria, Jordan, it shouldn't matter. But of course, these universal ideologies often get subverted to more ethnic uses. And we all know Benedict Anderson admits that he was just shocked when, after the communists won Vietnam, the first thing they did was to have a little war with China. Communists are not supposed to fight each other. But, of course, Vietnamese communism was Vietnamese communism. So in the same way, the Ba'ath had a rhetoric of universalism that was actually subverted by increasingly being used for sectional purposes, for the purposes of enriching and enhancing the power and prestige of the Sunni minority. As a reaction to the rise of the mass parties, which had these universalistic identities, some Shiites began worrying, traditionalist Shiites began worrying that they were losing the young people of their community. And so they began organizing the Dawa Party in the late 1950s. The Dawa Party was modeled in many ways, I think, on the Communist and Ba'ath parties. It was a covert party. It was a revolutionary party. It had cells, and its aim was a utopian state, but not a workers' paradise, as with the communists, nor an Arab paradise, as with the Ba'ath, but a Shiite paradise, or at least an Islamic one, and in which Islamic law would be implemented and an Islamic state would be attained. Muhammad Bakr Sadr, the theorist of the Dawa, and by the way, it wasn't predominantly a clerical party. It was largely lay, and it had about 10% Sunni members in the 1960s in its golden age. He was, I think, the first to put forward this idea of an Islamic state within Shiism, and I think he was much influential on Ayatollah Khomeini, although Khomeini took his ideas in a different direction, because Muhammad Bakr Sadr had not envisaged clerical rule. He had thought there would be a shura council or a kind of parliament, but he did want Islamic law implemented, and he also had a kind of socialistic interpretation of Islamic law. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, as well as trouble between the Ba'ath and Shiites in 1977, in which there were riots in the shrine cities and in East Baghdad, which had become a kind of Shiite slum, scared the Ba'ath, and in 1979 Saddam Hussein had come to power within the Ba'ath in an internal party putsch, and Khomeini came out and said that the Iraqi Shia, who were a majority, should rise up and do to the Ba'ath what the Iranians had done to the Shah. And Saddam, having come to power, was determined that that not happen. And so he had Mohammed Bakr al-Sadr killed, along with his sister and a number of other prominent leaders of the Dawa party. Then he made it a capital crime to belong to the al-Dawa party in any way. And so many of the mass graves we're finding in southern Iraq are full of people who were found to be Dawa party members. The secret police captured the party lists and so forth. Many Dawa party members fled to Tehran. In fact, many Shiite activists who were working for a Shiite vision of Iraq fled to Tehran. And then the Iran-Iraq war began when Saddam invaded Iran, thinking that the best defense was a good offense. Most Shiites remained loyal to the Iraqi state. Most fought against the Iranians. They may be Shiites, but they're Arab Shiites and they're Iraqis, and they weren't interested in being ruled by Persians. But over time, because of Saddam's repression, we think 300,000 to 400,000 Iraqi Shiites did go to Iran and became refugees there. About 40,000 troops deserted to Iran. That's a small number because Iraq had a huge army, a million-man army. And some Kurds also toyed with an alliance with Iran and in order to gain greater autonomy from Iraq. And it was in response to that budding alliance that Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds in the Anfal campaign in 1988, which one of the great atrocities in modern Iraqi history. And so, as things developed under the Ba'ath, the particular style of rule that Saddam Hussein had, the very strong way in which he based his power on, and this is something that Phoebe Marr has talked about, on the center of the country, really, where he could get a slight Sunni majority, and then marginalize the north and the south. So people in the deep south, in Hilla and Basra, were marginalized. People in the north, in Kurdistan, were marginalized. In Tehran in 1982, Khomeini organizes the Iraqi expatriates into the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, an umbrella group that grouped many of the Shiite activists who had fled to Iran. And the Supreme Council then develops a paramilitary capability, sends fighters over to hit Ba'athist targets. In other circumstances, we might call them terrorists. And gets gradually a lot of influence in some parts of Iraq. So the fighters would come through the marshes into Basra. Fighters would come over through eastern Kurdistan areas and around Diyala province through Baquba. So that kind of eastern part of Iraq over time became much influenced by the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq and its Badr Corps fighters who were trained by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. After the Gulf War, in which Saddam, having lost the Iran-Iraq War and being deeply in debt and wanting still to be powerful, that invaded Kuwait. It was kind of bank robbery just to get at Kuwait's money so that he could pursue his ambitions. That was stopped by the international coalition under George Bush Sr. And in the wake, during that war, Bush Sr. called upon the Iraqis to rise up and overthrow Saddam. None of us can figure out why he said that. He doesn't seem to have meant it. Personally, I think, the Bushes, despite their current plebeian airs and their preference for country music, according to the current president's iPod, are actually from Connecticut. And I think Bush Sr. probably meant that the better sort of Iraqis should rise up and overthrow Saddam. But it was the common people who listened to him. There was a great rebellion. So the Ba'ath Party was kicked out of power in 16 of the provinces, and it was a real revolution. And the Ba'ath Party really could only hope to come back if it were allowed to use helicopter gunships and tanks against this revolution. The United States could have interdicted that. It did not. And so the revolution was brutally crushed. Many Shiites still do not forgive the United States for standing by and allowing them to be killed after Bush Sr. had called for them to rise up. The aftermath played out differently in the South and the North, with the Shiites being killed in very large numbers in Najaf and Karbala and Basra and so forth in the South. The Kurds had the presence of mind to flee. And they fled way up into the mountains, where, however, they would have died, because there wasn't a way to live up there, if no one had intervened. And then the reporters went, and there were TV cameras, and Bush Sr. was presented with the prospect that 1 million Kurds would starve to death on his watch, which would have been very bad publicity. And so he was forced, unlike in the Shiite South, Bush Sr. was forced to intervene to save the Kurds, and General J. Garner played a role in that. And a no-fly zone was established, which would keep the Ba'ath military from incursions into the far north. And under that no-fly zone, the Kurds organized to establish a semi-autonomous state with its own parliament, its own traditions of politics, its own political parties. As quickly as they could, they stopped teaching their kids much Arabic. All of those of us who have suffered through the hollow verbs can understand this instinct. And so ethnic subnationalism advanced very substantially in the Kurdish region. And then over time, of course, things like television and ultimately television networks began a process, along with schooling, of linguistic standardization. Many more Kurds can probably understand each other now than was true a century ago. And in the Shiite areas, the aftermath was a period of quietism, but underneath, people were organizing. A lot of Shiites, it seems to me, began turning to clerical institutions for guidance in a way that Iraqi Shiites probably had not done before. Hannah Batatu, a great historian of Iraq, once did a calculation of mullahs per person in Iran and Iraq. Found many mullahs per person in Iran, few mullahs per person in Iraq. The Iraqi Shiism was not terribly clerically oriented in that period that Batatu was looking at in the 60s and 70s. But I think in the 90s, people began turning to the Shiite religious authority, what was called the Marja'iyah, because so much else had been destroyed by Saddam. The major leader, to whom probably the majority turned, was Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who was a quietist, didn't get involved in politics at that time. But he had a competitor, some say a competitor initially supported by Saddam, but the two broke, called Mohammad Sadiq al-Sadr, from that same Sadr family. You know, the British expelled a Sadr during the Great Rebellion to Iran, calling him a troublesome mullah. And then Muhammad Bakr al-Sadr made trouble for the Ba'ath, and he was executed. And now Sadiq al-Sadr came along. It's a very troublesome family. Argued for something like a Khomeini-style Islamic Republic. He called it a third way between Iraqi Shiism and Iranian Shiism, but it would amount to much the same thing. And he organized Friday prayers when Saddam had forbidden them out in the slums and tribal areas, Islamic courts to bypass the Ba'ath. He attracted the Arab tribes of the south, including increasingly Marsh Arabs, to come and study with him. And there begins this process of the Islamization of the Marsh Arabs. They become much more oriented towards clerical Shiism. And even in the north, where you have a minority of Turkmen, probably about 750,000, and about half of them Shiites. But they were heterodox Shiites. They were like the California New Age Shiites. They had many myths and so forth, and were not clerical. And a lot of them started turning to Sadiq al-Sadr as well. So these heterodox groups within Iraqi Shiism begin being gathered up in this what we would call a fundamentalist movement. Sadat Sadr was executed by Saddam, was assassinated by Saddam in 1999, but his young son, Muqtada Sadr, went underground and continued to keep the movement going, and also some of Sadat Sadr's disciples did as well. So this was the situation when the United States invaded Iraq. I would argue Iraq in the 1990s was actually in a revolutionary situation. The Kurds more or less had made a revolution and had a sort of mini-state of their own. The Shiites had several groups, the Sadr movement, the Dawa Party, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which were trying to make a revolution. There were very, very substantial riots in the Shiite areas when Sadat Sadr was killed, which were not well covered in the Western press and which we still don't know enough about. And so what the United States did was to come into that revolutionary situation and blow the lid off of it and tell people now they're free to do as they please. Well, we know what they wanted to do. They wanted to make revolutions. So in the aftermath of the American War, Grand Ayatollah Sistani emerges as a major leader of the Shiites and issues fatwas which forced the Americans, quite against their will, to follow through on their promise of moving towards Iraqi democracy. Initially, the Bush administration wanted to restrict the electorate to council members that had kind of been massaged into place by the Americans and the British. And Sistani said that al-hukuma shar'iyya munbathiqa min iradat al-shab al-Iraqi. The legitimate government derives from the will of the Iraqi people. I maintain that he took Rousseau's social contract and slapped Mr. Bremer with it twice. And got what he wanted, open elections, which were held last January. Muqtada Sadr emerged as a major leader as well, and one who obviously liked to organize militias and engaged in a kind of thuggish politics. Again, continued to attract to himself increasing numbers of marginal people, slum dwellers, the Marsh Arabs, Turkmen, and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq appears to have done marvelous organizing work, opening offices, getting people on its side, and so forth, and the Dawa Party as well. The Sunni Arabs were deprived of their main vehicle politics, which was the Ba'ath Party, which was dissolved, and they were all fired and sent home, and so forth. And they saw the Shiites mobilizing on religious grounds, and they saw the Shiite clerics coming to the fore as effective leaders. And so the Sunni Arabs, who had been largely secular, seem increasingly in the last 2 years to have turned to religious parties and leaders to express their national or their subnationalism. You have the Association of Muslim Scholars, which is a very hard line, what is called Salafi movement, the Sunni revivalist movement. The Iraqi Islamic Party, which is descended from the old Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood, and opinion polls and voting patterns, everything we can tell shows there's been this shift away from secularism towards these religious parties. Whether people have become more pious, I don't know, but they certainly have started putting more political faith in the religious. And of course, much of Sunni Arab frustration was expressed through a guerrilla war that they got up, which was conducted by Salafis, by ex-Baathists. Some of the ex-Baathists themselves turned to political Islam, or had begun doing so even in the late Saddam period. And then you have some small number of foreign fighters coming in. They have been greatly exaggerated in their numbers and effectiveness. In the Fallujah campaign, only 6% of the fighters captured were foreigners. And unless we posit that foreigners somehow can run faster than Iraqis, it seems pretty clear that most of the violence in the guerrilla war has been being conducted by Iraqi Sunni Arabs. But again, increasingly with the religious rhetoric, and even in some cases reaching out towards an Al-Qaeda type of Islam. And this is unimaginable. As I stand here before you, to say the words that Sunni Arabs from Baghdad would be talking like bin Laden, it just boggles my mind. I mean, it's incredible as a datum. And this process that I've been talking about, whereby the subnationalisms were expressed, which I think really begins in the Saddam Hussein period in a big way, comes to fruition in the January 30th elections, in which the Iraqi public, almost to a person, voted along ethnic subnational lines. Grand Ayatollah Sistani put together a coalition of Shiite religious parties called the United Iraqi Alliance, and then he endorsed it. Actually, the word he used was blessed it. He said baraktuha. He said, well, there may be other good parties and so forth, but this is the one that I know and I bless it. So they used his image on their campaigns, and their symbol was a candle, hint, hint. And they won big. They had something on the order of 53-54% of the seats in parliament. The Kurds came out in large numbers and voted for the Kurdistan Alliance and have 75 members in parliament, much disproportionate to their actual proportion of the population, but the election was set up on a national basis with proportionality. The Sunni Arabs didn't vote. 2% of Anbar province voted. I was brought on CNN the day of elections to explain what was going on, and I pointed out that the Sunni Arabs weren't voting because I'd already seen the Arabic satellite feeds. And the CNN anchor argued with me. He said, well, that's not what we're hearing. Well, he was wrong. And why was he bringing me there if he already knew? They only got 17 seats in parliament. 3 of the seats they got because 3 people, Sunnis, were in Sistani's list, carried along by that. And in the provinces, this tendency towards the politicization of ethnic identity was even clearer. The Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq won big in places like Najaf. Even at one point they were leading in Samarra, which means that the Sunnis in Samarra, which is a largely Sunni town, didn't vote. And this very small Shiite minority was coming out and voting. To have the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq win or lead in Sunni Arab areas would have warmed the cockles of Khomeini's heart. And the Sadr movement actually has maneuvered itself into control of Basra. And these provincial victories have long-term consequences because then they pack the bureaucracy with their guys. It's like Jacksonian America. It's a spoils system. There's going to be, and their police, the police become militiamen of their party and so forth. So my conclusion is that the Iran-Iraq War, the crackdown of Saddam on the Shiites and the Kurds, partially in connection with that war, the 1991 suppression of the uprising, and then the U.S. war have all contributed to a heightening of religious ethnic identities in Iraq and the shunting aside of the secular universalistic Ba'ath ideology. There's nothing really to take its place on a national scale has contributed to this phenomenon. And I would say that it seems to me very likely that religious and ethnic politics will continue to play an extremely important role as Iraq goes forward, and that there is some question about whether this kind of consociational politics is stable. That it seems to me there could be events, unexpected events that could cause Kurdistan to erupt in violence and make it very difficult for it to remain in Iraq, for instance. I think some of the southern Shiite provinces are talking about getting together and forming a federation as well. I'm not predicting civil war or breakup of Iraq. I'm simply saying that the direction in which Iraq is headed is not one that bodes well for national unity. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much for an extremely enlightening talk. Professor Cole is going to receive questions, and he'll field these questions himself. We have a person with a microphone going around right here, and please wait till you have the microphone in hand. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about Iran and the prospect of using the Shiite and Kurd against Iran in the future? That's, my question. Yeah, the possibility of that. Because as you mentioned, the role of the West, imperialism, before British and now America, using the ethnicity as one card in order to destabilize. And we have seen in Iraq before, and now in Iran, for example, one of their scholars called Brenda Schiffer, that is very much working on Turkish ethnicity, and Professor Mangule Bayat, she said very right in reviewing her book that this is a colonial card and it's not going to work. It's it's an old card. So I want to know at this point, because it's not, being a Shia, it doesn't mean really anything. They spend a lot of money. They have spent $90 million in order to bring this election. I mean, that's to me, is weird that behind Mr. Jafari is standing Shalabi. Don't you think so? That's sort of weird.
Okay, well, let me take the question.
But I want to know, by figure like Sha'lan, Hazem Sha'lan, and others, is it there is a possibility that using Shia and Kurd against Iran, because the Kurd are acting very opportunistic.
Yes.
This kind of ethnic identity was, as you went through, it was not there before.
In the beginning of the 19th century. Yes, thank you. Iran, as a factor in all this, is important. It gave refuge to the Iraqi expatriate Shiites who were religious activists. The Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq was formed under the auspices of Ayatollah Khomeini. The Badr Corps paramilitary of that party was trained by the Revolutionary Guards. And the Dawa party also had a Tehran branch, was very much beholden to the Iranian state. Jalal Talabani is very close, the Kurdish leader, to Tehran, and so forth. So the Iranian factor is there. I think it's much more likely that the Iranians will find a way to use the Iraqi Shiites and Kurds against the Americans than the other way around. And there's some reason to think that has already been happening. The Iranians were big supporters of holding these elections on January 30th, ones that initially Mr. Bremer did not want. And they even say that whatever contacts they had in the Sunni Arab community in Iraq, the Iranians were encouraging them to vote as well. So the Iranians are very happy. There's a way in which Iran is the major beneficiary of U.S. foreign policy in the eastern Middle East in the past 3 years. The Iranian regime had two major enemies, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda on the one hand, and Saddam Hussein on the other. The United States has removed both. The Iranians had two major allies, the Northern Alliance of Afghanistan, which includes the Hizb-e-Wahdat, the Hazara Shiite party in Afghanistan, on the one hand, and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. The United States has put both into power. Supreme Jurisprudent Ali Khamenei, in his New Year's address last year, exulted that the Taliban were gone, Saddam was gone. He said it is true that there's more unwelcome influence in the region of the great Satan. However, things are good.
But that's not encircled. You just leave that out. Iran is encircled by the United States.
Yeah, well, I'm not so sure. I think they have us right where they want us. Let's take this one, then we'll go there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether you could speculate a little bit about what it is that leads voters in southern Iraq to choose between Dawa, Skiri, and the Sadarist parties, in particular between OMS and Fadile, and in particular, when were you last in southern Iraq, and what were your impressions on the ground?
My wife says that if I try to go to Iraq, the guerrillas won't have to kill me. why are these parties voting for? Why are voters voting for these parties? Well, they have organizational capacity. These parties were what people were doing back in the 90s when they were trying to avoid domination by the Ba'ath. People it turns out, the Americans had this idea of Iraq as a kind of totalitarian state. And of course, there are some political scientists who question the usefulness of the whole idea of totalitarianism because societies are hard to penetrate. They're hard to make completely legible. And Iraq, which was under the late Saddam period extremely ramshackle, was less legible than most. I mean, what do you think would have happened to a Ba'athist who showed up in East Baghdad, in what was then called Saddam City? They would have had their throats slit. There was it was not possible, in fact, for the Iraqi secret police to know everything going on in the slums of these Shiite southern cities. It wasn't possible for them to control the Marsh Arabs, for instance, very, very closely. So people snuck around. They had meetings, and they formed little cliques, and they, in a broad way, affiliated themselves with Dawah, with the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, or with the Sadr group. And when the Americans got rid of the Ba'ath and removed restrictions on organizing, the evidence that I've been able to gather is that these groups were very good at grassroots organizing. Karl Rove has nothing on them. There are reports of the Supreme Council sending out emissaries to all the little villages around Basra and opening offices. And of course, they have a certain amount of money. Some of it probably comes from Iran. But even the ability of what's left of the Iraqi middle classes who are religious to support these activities is not insubstantial. And so they're giving people sometimes jobs and patronage and so forth, and promising them more. If you vote for me, your cousin gets a job in such and such bureaucracy. I think there may be other things going on as well. In the aftermath of the war, social order broke down in much of Iraq. There was, of course, a great deal of looting, crime. There's still a lot of crime. There's waves of kidnapping. There were, in some areas of Baghdad, for a while, people stopped driving their cars because they kept getting carjacked. And although it's my impression that the severity of the crime wave has subsided somewhat, it's still a condition of great insecurity. And these are law and order parties. What are they saying? They're saying if somebody is a burglar, they should be taken out and shot on the spot. Young girls were being kidnapped. Well, they're saying keep the girls home or make them bail, control them in various ways. Liquor stores were doing great business, and they firebombed the liquor stores because it is like in the time of Prohibition in the United States. Sort of unemployed young men near liquor stores is generally considered a bad idea by a lot of people, and so they got rid of them. So I think there was a yearning, as far as I can tell, for law and order among a lot of Iraqis, and these parties were the parties that were promising that. I think Iyad Alawi and his group that was put into power by the Americans and the United Nations in an interim government tried very hard to hit that note, to say, well, we're for law and order, we're going to crack down. But since they were the government, and since very clearly there wasn't much order, I think they took the blame for not doing a better job, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think they never quite understood what the Iraqis meant by law and order, because Alawi would get up in the morning and say, the Americans need to bomb Fallujah more. Well, that wasn't what the Iraqis were going for when they wanted him to take control of the situation, that he should encourage the Americans to bomb them more. So I think he struck me as just having a tin ear when it came to popular politics. Whereas Muqtada Sadr, somebody who knows exactly what to say. He says the American troops should leave immediately. And he says, we can supply our own order. And he says, we're not going to be having any of this Western influence that causes our society to deteriorate and become immoral and be full of crime and so forth. Those are my impressions. I've had extensive email contact with people in places like Basra over the past couple of years, and I've been reading the Iraqi press as assiduously as I can, and those are the things that come out of it.
A question?
Well, I had promised this woman over here that she would be next.
Thank you. You talked a lot. You used the literacy and language planning and standardization as being an important agency for national unity. But to the extent that most people possibly speak Arabic, so that will be a unifying agency throughout the history of the world. What is the role of the European languages, colonial languages, for example, like English or French in the region, but also comparatively, for example, religion, Islam should be a unifying factor from its humanistic level. The relationship with ethnicity and religion doesn't seem as being some sort of irrational or divisive. Doesn't seem to make sense. For example, here there's been in the media talk about religious fundamentalism, neoconservatism coming because of religion. Can you make this comparison and clarify the relationship between religion being fundamental and divisive, and the question of languages?
All right. Well, with regard to language, Arabic, of course, has been a major vehicle for Iraqi national unity. And the Iraqi state has tried to establish schooling in Arabic throughout the country and to have that be the common language. However, there are linguistic minorities. There are Turkmen, there are Kurds, there are some Chaldeans who speak Aramaic at home. And one of the things that happened in the no-fly zone was the Kurds did not educate their children in Arabic nearly as much as had earlier been the case. In fact, I just heard a report from Mosul the other day on National Public Radio, in which it was said that some Kurdish Peshmerga fighters had been detailed to the governor of Mosul, who is an Arab, to protect him, but that they don't know Arabic. And I think that's an artifact of the past nearly 20 years. I think had fighters been sent down to Mosul from Kurdistan in the 1970s, they most likely would have known Arabic. I think things have gone backward in that regard. Iraq is probably less linguistically unified now than it was. With regard to religion being a unifying force, can be, and there have been cross-sectarian religious alliances. The Shiites of Najaf sent aid to the Sunni Salafis of Fallujah, and vice versa. There can be a sense of Iraqi national unity that says, well, we're all Muslims together, we're all Iraqis together, we should cooperate against a common foe. In that regard, the U.S. military presence in Iraq may be a good thing for Iraqi unity. But what I was suggesting was that although those sentiments exist, and people will tell you this all the time, in fact, I'm quite sure a lot of Iraqis would be very disturbed by my presentation today. They would simply deny that what I'm saying is true. They didn't vote that way. There's no sign of this cross-sectarian unity in the voting patterns. And it's really quite disturbing, in fact, the way they did vote. Well, let's mix it up over here.
Some people say that there should be three separate states, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. What is your opinion? Three separate.
Yeah. Well, I'm not I'm not going to tell the Iraqis how to lead their lives. I think we've had enough of that. What I can say is that there would be disadvantages to such a thing. And let me lay out what I think are the disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that despite that nice map with the green and the brown and so forth, in fact, Iraqis are all spread around. So there are about 1 million Kurds in the Baghdad province. There are about 1 million Sunni Arabs in the south of the country. And there's a fair amount of intermarriage in Iraq. It's an interesting phenomenon. I think more so than, say, in Lebanon, just cross-sectarian, cross-ethnic marriages. Ghazi al-Yawar, the outgoing president and still the vice president, is a wonderful example of how mixed up Iraqis are, because he's from the Shemer tribe, and the Shemer are a major tribe in Iraq, the majority of whom are Sunni, but they do have a Shiite branch, so he has Shiite cousins. And then he took as his second wife the Minister of Public Works in the first post-war government, Nasreen Barwari, who was a Kurd. And they were serving together on the interim governing council and fell in love. It's really quite a romantic story, although since he wants to be president and she wants to be a minister, I think there's also maybe a Hillary Clinton kind of aspect to it. So what would dividing up Iraq that way do to the al-Yawar family? So there would be massive ethnic cleansing. There would be millions of people would be displaced. It would be a horrible, horrible thing. And then more disadvantages. Right now, I mean, we think there's probably substantial petroleum reserves all over the country, including near Fallujah, which makes one hope the Fallujahs can get their act together because they're going to get rich if they can. But, you know, having petroleum and getting rich are not the same thing, because the Sudanese have it too, and no sign of they're going to get rich anytime soon because they're too busy fighting with one another. But in the short term, until that happened, the major petroleum producing fields are Rumaila in the south and Kirkuk in the north. Who's going to get those? Well, obviously the Shiites get Rumaila. That's the good one to have. That's big. And will go on for a long time. The Kurds would get Kirkuk maybe, but they'd have to fight for it because the Turkmen want it, and there's a substantial Arab population up north that wants it. So there's going to be a lot of bloodshed over that. And then even if they did get it, I think Kirkuk fields are going to run dry in 20 or 30 years. I'd personally, if I were Iraqi, I'd want to maintain some kind of connection to the Rumaila field rather than cutting myself off from it. And so the Kurds could end up, being poor shepherds again if the oil goes away. And then the Sunni Arabs might get nothing at all, which means that they would become a much less prosperous form of Jordan. Not a happy fate. So I don't see how that works. Finally, there are geopolitical considerations in all this. The Turks desperately don't want there to be a Kurdish state in the north and have occasionally even threatened to invade were that to look like it might happen. And although the Iranians don't make as big noises about it as the Turks do, the Iranians don't want it either because they have a substantial Kurdish minority, which has sometimes had trouble with that regime, since they're mainly Sunnis. The Saudis don't want it because if the Shiite south of Iraq became independent and it was the successor state to the Ottoman governorate of Basra, it might start making claims on the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which was traditionally Shiite and where the oil is. When we say Saudi Arabia has oil, we do not mean Jeddah or Mecca or Najaf. Or Riyadh has oil. We mean Al-Hassa has oil. So. And the Shiites there could hook up with the Sadrists and become militant and sabotage pipelines and so forth. So for the Saudis, this whole thing has been a nightmare. They could we please go back to the way it was? And they're not going to be able to. The Saudis are threatened both by the possibility of the politicization of their own 10% Shiite minority, which is largely in the oil areas, as well as they're afraid of the radicalization of the Sunni Arab population of Iraq, which is not so far from Saudi Arabia, and you could have Al-Qaeda kind of stuff spilling back over into Saudi Arabia from Sunni Iraq. So, the Americans think like the Saudis are Wahhabis, and they have this strict form of Islam. They were spreading it around. They caused all this trouble. But from a Saudi point of view, the Americans went into Baghdad and got rid of secularism and are encouraging Al-Qaeda kind of stuff among the Sunni Arabs of Iraq, and they're the ones who are causing all the trouble and threatening Saudi Arabia. Phoebe,
yeah.
You want to ask a question? You can ask a question. You already know the answer, though.
No, I don't actually, Juan. But I do want to ask a question because I think it's an important one for the debate. And I'll play the devil's advocate just a little. Actually, I agree with your analysis here, essentially. But it may be a tad too much on the ethnic and sectarian identity. Let's look at this. Actually, it seems to me that the Shia alliance got a slight majority, not quite 54, I think less than that. And they only got that because the proportional representation votes were added after the election. As you said, the Kurds got more than their share because the Sunnis didn't vote. It might have gone a little bit the other way. So maybe these ethnic and sectarian blocs are not quite as tight as they might be. Now, I'm asking myself, what's happened to the middle class, the more secularists, the people who might bury this identity? And we know that the Baathists and others are out. They're in an insurgency now, which is putting great stress on the system. But I would say, let me pose this issue. The old middle class, the people who are more secular, etc., many of them are in the Shia alliance. The Kurds seem to me to be more solid, and some Sunnis did vote. We don't even know how many voted in Baghdad. But Alawi got 14% of the vote. If you add Yawar's something like 2% and a collection of some others, you might come to something like 15, 16% of the population voted for non-sectarian, non-ethnic allegiance, more secular, more centrist, and so on. That's a terrible reduction of the old middle class and so on. I'm not painting that as a success and so on, but still, it's 15%. There's something there. So the question I really want to raise is how what shall I say? For the future, how well are these blocs going to stick together? The Kurds might even disintegrate if they get success, but certainly the Shia alliance. The big question here is the Shia identity. What does it mean? They did vote for Shia identity. It's clear that religious leaders can call out the vote, and they will be followed. But there are a lot of people there that don't like this, and might, in fact, want to go back to something more secular as a block against some of this religion. So the question really is, how solid is the Shia alliance? Because as you point out, this is a little bit simplistic. Not everybody is Shia, not everybody is Kurd. These are not homogeneous communities. There are many cross-cutting ethnic and sectarian marriages, etc., and many sub-nationalist identities. Tribal, middle class, professional, etc., that are embedded within these alliances. So can you imagine this dissolving, breaking up, eroding over time, or is this what we're really going to get? I think that's a very critical issue. Is it a kind of one-time fluke, or can you imagine it shuffling around in different ways sometime in the future under various and sundry pressures?
Well, our experience from Iran would suggest that things don't last. I think Khomeini actually was very popular in Iran in the 1980s, and the clerics were as well. And of course now only 15% vote for them. And so things can change. I think actually that the Shiite religious parties did so well in the provincial elections may hurt them, because now they're in charge of the provinces, and the provinces are at the level at which people are going to expect them to provide services and water and electricity. And why would we think they would be able to do that? The Americans couldn't. So there may be a backlash against them eventually. The evidence that I saw in the press was that the Shiite middle classes voted for Alawi's list in Baghdad and in Basra, and that was where his 14% mainly came from, was those two places and that stratum. So it would make you think that were unemployment to fall under 50% and things to start looking up in Iraq and there'd be more middle classes and so forth, that maybe they would like a more secular kind of government as well. I mean, a lot of the vote for the Sistani list was coming from poor and lower middle class neighborhoods, and it was a sign of some desperation. There was, what that vote meant varied, as you say, a great deal from place to place. I think people in Najaf, I've got friends from Najaf and people who called home and talked. One guy asked his uncle, what did you vote? He said, of course I voted. He said, I don't want to go to hell. And so, that's a very Najafi point of view on the whole thing. I don't think probably people in the nice parts of Basra think like that. We don't know whether this religious Shiite victory will hold together or whether it will be repeated in the next election, which is, after all, I very much doubt it can be held in December, but probably within a year or so. On the other hand, there is also a possibility that these guys will ensconce themselves, at least for the medium term, because, as I say, it's a spoils system. The religious Shiite parties do have a majority in parliament, whatever exactly the number comes to. I count them with 150 or so, 148 anyway, because people like Abdul Karim Mohammedawi, the leader of the Marsh Arabs, in a snit says, well, I'm not going to be part of this because you guys are taking too long to form a government. But who's he really going to vote with? So anyway, that means that if they can get $17 billion a year in revenue, even with the sabotage from petroleum and other sources, it means the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq and the Dawa Party have $17 billion a year. They control the government. They control the income. And that's one thing that might keep them together, too, because if you withdraw from the alliance, then you lose that $17 billion. That's a lot of money to spread around patronage with and form links of clientelage and so forth. So it could be that they'll even do even better the next time, having parlayed the advantages they gained from their victory into a position of commanding authority. And that would be my guess. My guess is medium term, 5-10 years out, religious Shiite parties are probably the key factor in the development of contemporary Iraq. After that, all bets are off because things change. And imagine somebody who's now 9 and in school, what are they going to think like when they're 20? That's something we can't predict. And then they may be pretty tired of Muqtada Sadr by then. So I think you're right to be cautious about what it means for the future, but in the short to medium term, I think it's a real thing.
Shall we take one more question? And then I've been instructed that we need to adjourn across the street. One last question.
All right here.
Well, I had 2 questions, so you can pick one if the 2 is too many. But you mentioned a little bit towards the end of your discussion Kurdistan, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. What are the various outcomes you could see in 5, 10, 20, whatever you think is the relevant time frame, years, and what would be the factors that would lead to one rather than the other being more likely? And then my second question was, what effect you think the election had on the resistance movement, because you hear sort of in popular media lots of fake hypotheses on this, and I was interested in hearing yours, both in terms of the internal organization of the resistance and also the links of the resistance to the Sunni population or the larger population.
Well, this is your second question first, very briefly. The guerrilla movement is a guerrilla movement. They don't care if people have elections or not. They're trying to destabilize the country. The plan is you destabilize the country, very possibly by fomenting ethnic violence amongst Shiites and Sunnis and Arabs and Kurds. and make the country ungovernable. At that point, the Americans would have to leave. Once the Americans have left, you take over the TV station, surround the green zone, and declare a coup. So these old Ba'ath military guys still think in those terms, and they lost in '63 and came back. They think they can do it again. So I don't think the election matters at all in that regard. Those people are going to go on fighting. I think we're stuck with them for 10 years or so. I mean, I don't think they can win, but they can make life hell in the meantime. And I think they're very determined. They've got a lot of resources. There are 250,000 missing tons of munitions in Iraq. There were 600,000 to begin with. And the U.S. military has done an excellent job of destroying that stuff, but they haven't gotten it all. 250,000 tons of munitions is a lot of munitions, and the Baathists, the ex-Baathists, are the ones who know where it is. And then they get money from outside, too. I mean, there are a lot of millionaires, nouveau riche millionaires in the Gulf who see the Sunni Arabs of Iraq as being under siege, perfectly willing to send over money. So they've got resources, they've got determination, they would go on fighting. And they very much, I mean, if they could, what they would do is just to take the new government out and shoot it. And that's why the new government has not demanded that the Americans leave. They say they wish they would, but they don't say it very loud, very insistently. With regard to Kurdistan, there's a simple variable, it seems to me, that will explain everything. If ethnic conflict in the north can be reworked into ordinary parliamentary politics, so that parliamentary compromises are achieved on issues like the disposition of Kirkuk, the oil city which is claimed by the Turkmen, the Kurds, and the Arabs, on issues like redrawing the provincial boundaries of Iraq, because the Kurds want a Kurdistan province, an ethnically based super province that would include 3 present provinces plus parts of another 3. In essence, become more like Pakistan, where you have Baluchistan and Punjab and the ethnically based provinces. So if that can be done, and one Shiite politician has suggested, well, yeah, we could do that, and then we make 2 Shiite provinces and 1 Sunni one, or 2 Sunni ones, Sunni Arab ones, and then you just have 5, 6 provinces, and the Kurds get Kurdistan. Some political scientists suggest that a country with a small number of ethnically based provinces is less stable. You can see that in a place like Nigeria or the original Pakistan, which included what is now Bangladesh. But that seems to be where things are going. So if those kinds of things can be worked out, there were negotiations on how much of the Kirkuk oil money stays at home rather than going to Baghdad. The central government said they'd let the Kurds keep 17%. The Kurds said they wanted 24%. That kind of thing, it seems to me you could find, I could tell them what the solution is. It's simple math. So that kind of thing, if that can be done, then you might be able to erect an Iraqi federalism that's a relatively loose federalism. They talk about the Canada model. I think they really mean the Switzerland model, which would keep the Kurds in the federation. But there's a lot that could go wrong. If the Shiites, who are the main now interlocutors with the Kurds, if they're insufficiently flexible, if the Kurds are insufficiently flexible, or if some donkey cart gets turned over in Kirkuk and there's a riot that spreads throughout the city and a lot of Turkmen get killed, and the Turks are upset that their Turkmen were killed and they invade, and the Kurds rally to fight the Turkmen, and then the Arabs have to choose sides, and Kirkuk and the whole north explode, then that's the bad scenario. And that we can't predict, whether we can get through the next 5 years without Kirkuk exploding. I mean, it is a tinderbox.
Well, excellent presentation, and it gets our work for tomorrow off to just the right start. Now recall, you're all invited across the street for this open-hearted, open-minded reception. Please come and be able to talk to people who are so much.